As I said at the end of video lesson 5.1, Introduction to Derivations, in this review video, I'm going to work through the last three problems I assigned. These problems asked you to construct your own derivations for the provided arguments. The problems were on page 154 of the logic book, and they were 2A, 2C, and 2E. The solutions guide will also give you examples of derivations that successfully do these problems. The first problem asked you to derive the conclusion D and it's not the case that B from the premises A and it's not the case that B, and if A or it's not the case that C, then D. Our conclusion is a conjunction of D and it's not the case that B. So the strategy I'm going to take here is trying to get each of those conjuncts by themselves so that I can use conjunction introduction. Getting it's not the case that B by itself is really easy. We just use conjunction elimination from line 1. So now we need to try to get D on its own. We can see that we have D as the consequent of the conditional on line 2. So if we want to use conditional elimination, we need the antecedent, A, or it's not the case that C, first. We can get A from line 1 via conjunction elimination. And then, because what we're trying to get is a disjunction, it has that or, we can tack on the or not C by using disjunction introduction on line 5. Now that we have A or it's not the case that C on a line by itself, we can use conditional elimination from line 2 with the whole conditional and line 5 with the antecedent to get the consequent D on line 6. The last step to get our conclusion is to put the conjuncts together using conjunction introduction from D on line 6 and it's not the case that B on line 3. The next problem asked you to derive it's not the case that D or E from the premises A and it's not the case that B, and it's not the case that B if and only if A, if and only if not D. This is another problem where one of the disjuncts in our conclusion doesn't occur anywhere in the premises. So we know we're going to have to use disjunction introduction after we get not D by itself. So we're going to start with the goal of getting it's not the case that D out of where it is in line 2. It's in a biconditional that is one side of another biconditional that's the main connective. So to use biconditional elimination, we need to get the other side of the main biconditional, it's not the case that B, by itself. We can do that with conjunction elimination from line 1. So now on line 4, we can use biconditional elimination from lines 2 and 3 to get A if and only if it's not the case that D. This was in parentheses as the other side of our main biconditional. And now we repeat the process. We need A by itself to use biconditional elimination for the conditional on line 4. We can get A from conjunction elimination from line 1. And now we can get it's not the case that D on line 6 using biconditional elimination from lines 4 and 5. The last step is to use disjunction introduction to get our conclusion that it's not the case that D or E on line 7. And for this, we cite line 6 that has it's not the case that D, that is our disjunct that we know is true. The last problem was 2E. This one asked you to derive H and it is not the case that I from these three premises. Here our conclusion is a conjunction, so I'm going to try to get each of those conjuncts on their own and then use conjunction introduction at the end for the last step. Let's start by trying to get H. We see we have H as the consequent of the conditional on line 2, where the antecedent is it's not the case that G. I'm going to get not G by itself on line 4 using conjunction elimination from line 1. Now we can use conditional elimination from line 2 and line 4 to get H by itself on line 5, now that we've isolated that antecedent. Now I need to get the other conjunct of our conclusion. It's not the case that I. We see it's not the case that I in the biconditional on line 3, so I'm going to try to get the other side of that biconditional to use biconditional elimination. That other side of the biconditional is H, and it's not the case that F. We already have H on line 5, so I'm going to get it's not the case that F on line 6 using conjunction elimination from line 1. Now we can use conjunction introduction from line 5 that has H and line 6 that has it's not the case that F to get H and it's not the case that F. So now we have the left side of this biconditional on line 3, and we can now use biconditional elimination to get it's not the case that I, that other side of the biconditional on line 8, and here we cite line 3 and line 7. So we've successfully gotten both conjuncts of the conclusion on their own, H on line 5, and it is not the case that I on line 8. So we can use conjunction introduction on line 9 to complete this derivation. So that's my way of working through these problems. It might be different from the solutions in the logic book or different from the way you did it. As I said before, derivations are like puzzles and have more than one way to be done successfully. If your derivation looks different than mine, don't panic. You may have done it correctly. I just recommend you have someone, whether it's me or a classmate, look at your derivation to make sure you didn't make any mistakes.